I think I could hear.
So happy to see you.
Assalamualaikum.
Alhamdulillah. Alaikum salam. Alhamdulillah. How is California weather today?
It's mild. I mean, I can't complain. Last week we were poolside, so that was like a alhamdulillah. Like it's just, but now it's like I think in the 60s, 70s. So we're like, oh, it's freezing. We're such babies.
Oh, yes, you certainly are.
Yeah.
But I have to say, here I am in Minnesota, and I mean, I actually am quite happy with the cold because it says that at least we have a little bit of normalcy. For
Yeah.
so long, it's been, January was so weird, like for us here in Minnesota. I mean, it was so warm. We had literally up to 40 degrees, which I know to you sounds really cold, but for us, I mean, I remember as a child, there would be literally weather warnings where we couldn't go outside, or you would go out and your nose would freeze
Oh,
closed. It was so
subhanallah.
cold.
Yeah.
And that's just like, I mean, it's just not here anymore, subhanallah. So it's really, anyway, it's really sad actually,
Yeah, we
subhanallah.
need the Midwest winters. It's the changes. So, Assalamu alaikum everyone. I was so nervous because I couldn't hear sound and I was like, I was hearing music and we had all the technical things and then, like sometimes like I'm just with my time crunch, I just have such a like I want to do the best job and like and I'm just like
Inshallah.
it's with the sheikha. I want to impress her. I want to make sure I do the best
Oh
like
dear.
Allah's the best
Habibti, Allah khalina yaki. Well, my job here today is just to introduce you and your wonderful self. So before I do that, I just do want to say that I'm seeing some people talking about
plan.
sound. So I think probably you want to either go inside your computer. So sometimes inside of your
Mhm.
computer, there's a place that you can to the output louder. So if you go into your settings,
Mhm.
you can see a place where you have the microphone and it goes up and
Yeah.
down. So if you go up to, I know you're using the one from your
Mhm.
headphones, but even inside the computer, like sometimes it's dialed down. So if you dial it up,
Okay.
it might pick up your voice easier so that you don't have to like, shout.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Okay, I'll let you work on
okay.
that and I will introduce you. All right, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salatu salam ala khatam al-anbiya Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi ashabihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum and welcome. I am really excited about this month's, I'm going to call it an event because to me, this is an event. This is an important event. Our Black History Month this year is led by an amazing group of women who have really done some thoughtful, intentional work in how they wanted to present what usually, I mean, we've been doing a Black History Month recognition, I'm going to call it, for a couple of years now. But this year, it's really very well organized, mashallah. The gang who's been, I'm going to call them a gaggle, like geese, right? The gaggle of women who have been doing this work started way ahead of time. We have an amazing graphic designer who's working on all those posters you're seeing online. We consider those posters educational learning materials. So it's not considered just a, let's say, in quotes, a flyer, but an educational material that can not only be used by people viewing social media, but could be used by teachers in classrooms, etc. And we actually had someone reach out to us this morning, yesterday actually, saying, hey, I'd really like to build some curriculum around these amazing posters that you guys are posting. So that's really very intentional, and I'm really happy when people notice things like that. And part of the planning was we wanted to bring you someone who really can educate you, educate us, educate us and uplift us and really give us what we need. I mean, okay, not in what, something that is really going to, I can't think of the word that I want, but in education, we have this whole idea of standards and objectives. So we're always looking toward that objective and where we want to go. And so we wanted to bring you someone that would help us reach the objective of educating the Muslim community around Black history and also issues of racism and other things like that. And we've been working hard at that at Rabata in the past couple of years. And we really work hard in the whole area of diversity and wanting to be very inclusive of all of our sisters, maybe not our brothers so much, but all of our sisters. And so, alhamdulillah, so we are really, I personally do know how busy you are, and so how busy our guest is here today. And I'm extremely appreciative for her volunteering to come on to teach us and educate us. I'm going to say a little bit more about her. She is an adjunct professor. She is a blogger. She's an editor. She's a freelance writer, and she's had articles published in Sisters, in Islamic Monthly, in Spice Digest. I don't know what Spice Digest is, but I definitely want to know what it is because that sounds super cool. She is the co-founder, and this is how I know you. This is how I know our sister Margari. She's the co-founder and executive director of Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative. I apologize. I often say committee, so I apologize for all the hundreds of times that I have said that wrong. The Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, which is an organization focusing on education for liberation. I also want to say it's an incredibly important organization that has shined a light in spaces that we have been quite, as a worldwide community, have been and remain so, though I do think that Muslim Arc is doing a great job of helping us to get better, but we have been really quite blind to this issue and problem. After converting to Islam in 1993, so that makes you 17 years old, mashallah.
27, yeah.
What am I saying?
Yeah, I'll take the 27. I'll take the 17. We'll still do the reset.
I was like, wait a minute, that math is wrong. 1993, her life experiences as a Black American woman have informed her research and writing on Islam, education, race, and gender. She has nearly a decade of teaching experiences at all levels, from elementary, secondary, college level to adult education. She's worked in education at various capacities, including as a substitute teacher, instructor, curriculum design, school policy, teacher training, as well as a teaching assistant and teaching fellow. She taught writing and literature at Al-Aqsa Islamic Academy, developed and instructed an art and literacy class for Claire Muhammad's summer camp, and worked as a lead teacher and curriculum developer at United Muslim Masjid Summer Madrasa. And I know that when we write bios and we read bios, that we all have to recognize that this is just the tip of the iceberg. These are the things that got highlighted, but these are always an indicator of, as when I say tip of an iceberg, an indicator of all of the real mountain of work that lies below the sea and undercover of things that we don't know. She earned her bachelor's degree in history from Santa Clara University in 2003 and a master's in history of the Middle East and Islamic Africa from Stanford University in 2006. Her research includes colonial perceptions, mixed race identities, and mixed race identities in northern Nigeria, anti-colonial resistance among West Africans in Sudan during the early 20th century, transformations in Islamic learning in northern Nigeria, and international student programs at Al-Azhar and Cairo University. She's given talks and lectures in various universities and community centers throughout the country. And so I really wish that we were in a space right now where you could hear everyone's applause, because I know you would get a rounding applause and a standing ovation from everyone for just being here with us today. And I before you said, I want to tell you something I hope will make you happy. We had recently, there are two, and I'm saying this because I noticed through research, two women from Nigeria who found us on Twitter, and they found Rabata, and they are the most serious students. They collected, I think it's 40 some students together, and they have signed up for over 60 classes, and they are ready to, 58 students, I'm being told. They are ready to take on Nigeria. Like, they have a plan, and they are getting themselves educated, and they are moving forward with female scholarship and uplifting their country. And so I just thought, considering your research in Nigeria, that would really, that would give you a little have a spot
Yeah.
today.
And
Alhamdulillah.
inshallah, I can make it there, in light of, and I just,
Go together.
yeah, like we can all go together, like as sisters. I mean, it's just, in this 2020, in the United States, and even globally, like for Muslims, it's been a very difficult year. January, um, some people said that seemed like the longest month, and with you know, we know in America. Can you hear me?
Agree, but really there is a
Oh,
sound
is
problem.
there? Uh-oh. Okay, so let's do. I can hold this. I'm totally fine with hold. So with as we talk about Nigeria, and I'm going to bring that up because not just because my research is there, um, but the tradition of scholarship and women's scholarship in Nigeria is very dear to my heart. And I've written about Nana Asma'u, and I think that it's just very important for um, Muslim women globally to know about her work and her work in spreading Islam um, and solidifying Islam in the region and the impact that she's had on American Muslims too. So, I mean, I'll go into that in a little bit. Um, but just, keeping in mind that we have a like during this month with the expansion of the Muslim ban, which includes even more African countries that do have significant, and many of the countries have obviously significant Muslim populations, but they're also banned because of the racism, the ethno-nationalism of this administration. There are people in our government who really want to make sure that America stays a majority white country, even though the contributions of the indigenous peoples, um, for those of us who, like my ancestors, were forcibly migrated um, and enslaved, our contributions, and the contributions of the many immigrants who are in the United States. And with the expansion included Nigeria. And for a lot of people, that came as a big shock, especially given how significant the Nigerian American community has been and the contributions of Nigerian Americans. For example, like there are um, one of the largest communities of like immigrants from Africa. We have like, especially amongst Muslims, like we think about like of doctors, like we tend to think of South Asian and Arab, but um, Nigerians bring a lot of technical skills to the United States. And when I was in graduate school at Stanford, most of the graduate students, when we thought about within the elite schools, in our own snobbery, were the Niger students were highly represented. It was very interesting to see our Caribbean brothers and sisters, and then Nigerian brothers and sisters, and there's a lot of Kenyans also represented. So I want to really hold space for the Nigerian American community whose families are now being separated, who are feeling the tension around whether weddings, graduations. This has long-range impact. And that's the work that Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, we work within Muslim communities to address racism, to address the ways that we internalize ethno-nationalism, that we internalize racial inferiority or superiority, but we also work outside of Muslim communities to train people on the diversity of American Muslims and how we're impacted by multiple issues, racial justice issues. And so I'll kind of go in a little bit, kind of move a little bit away from,
I'm
okay,
gonna pop off and give you the
okay,
full
thank you.
screen so we can
Okay,
really focus on what you have to say. Thank you for being here,
okay,
and I'm right here
okay, and I'll
watching,
try
but
to
I'm
look
just not gonna have
here
my
if
face.
there's any, like any questions. Okay, so I'm going to step a little bit away from that kind of organizing space so that the image of Margari Hill, Sister Margari Hill, this historian, which I'm a historian by training. Um, I'm really bad at dates. and I'm also really bad at names. So how did I get to be a historian when I'm terrible at dates and numbers and sequences, and also remembering names? The reason why I started into history probably was planted um, when I was in elementary school, when I didn't know anything about my own history. And in fact, it was in 6th grade when I learned about Black History Month, and my teacher actually turned to me and asked me, the only identifiably Black student in my class, were any of my ancestors slaves? And for me, that I just can just remember shrinking in my seat and my heart sinking and just having so much shame, because throughout my elementary school, I was teased and called slave at times. And we're going to come back to that, this word slave, and having the deep shame of thinking I didn't have any history, that the only contribution that my people had was was working really hard in fields. And what did that do for a little girl? Like now I have an 8-year-old, and I'm really blessed to be able to teach Black History Month. And but for me, it closed down my imagination, where when I was reading books and stories, I couldn't see myself. And the other part where I saw, and this was during the 80s, the only images of Africa were usually either nature shows, or they showed African peoples who were not civilized or quote unquote civilized. So there was a lot of fetishizing of African people. Like they showed nomadic tribes, and often at this time on PBS daytime they would show topless Black women. And that also had me internalize a lot of self-hatred, because I didn't see the cities, I didn't see the history. I was taught that Africa really didn't have a history, and people would say things like, go back to Africa. And so in that internalized shame, there was a lot of self-hatred. And Malcolm X, he pointed out that in hating Africa and in hating Africans, we ended up hating ourselves without even realizing it. He said, because you can't hate the roots of a tree and not hate the tree. You can't hate your origin and not end up hating yourself. You can't hate Africa and not hate yourself. And that's the images that we were taught. Now, over time, like within a few years in the 80s, that we started to have, like this was even a time when they didn't celebrate Martin Luther King's Day. So there wasn't a lot of education about the civil rights movement. And in fact, at the time, my mother, she was a hoarder of books, and sometimes, she had a lot of old books. And the scientific racism reached me there, where I read an old book that claimed that, and they used still the term, Negroes had lower IQs. And eventually she admitted to me that she had internalized the myth when she was told that colored girls were intellectually inferior. And something changed for her when I was placed in a gifted and talented program in 4th grade. And that sent me on a totally different track. But I still did internalize a lot of self-hatred until we moved to a different school in East San Jose, and I learned from teachers the importance of Black History Month. And so during that first Black History Month, I was introduced to the liberation struggle of Black people through watching the documentary Eyes on the Prize. And it was a powerful but painful documentary that opened up with the murder of a boy, and this time he was my age, Emmett Till, and how that sparked a movement in the 50s where Black people who were continually working against their oppression from slavery, Jim Crow, being denied the right to vote. And the civil rights movement, it sparked anger, but it also gave me a sense of there's a struggle, and that I no longer had to suffer, right, with this sense of inferiority, that that my people, that they did not just stay complacent about oppression, that they worked against it to build a better world. And this is what I'm hoping that we can do today, is not just to think about history for history's sake, but to take inspiration from the liberation struggles throughout time of African people. And also to challenge the idea that people of African descent are inherently a servile class. And this is important because since the medieval period, that European thinkers had a myth, and I don't know if anybody's read about the Hamitic myth, which argued that Black people or Africans were descendants of Ham, the son of Noah, who had a curse on him. And this was something that I was taught too, that Black people had some type of curse. And this is something that's not accepted in Islam, and one of the reasons that did inspire me. But there were many things theologically that people in the West had drawn on to justify the horrific treatment of Black people, of enslaved Africans. Oh, so it just cut out. So let me see if I go back a little bit. That within Christian theology in the West, that they justified the horrific treatment of people of African descent, because the treatment was so horrific. Oh yes, the one about the sons of Ham. So that they utilized the Hamitic myth. So it was called Ham, like the idea that Noah's son Ham, he was cursed because he looked upon his father and laughed, and that in that curse it made them a permanent servile class, a permanent servile tribe or community. And then that myth was used to justify enslavement, because it was so, oh, this was taught by Europeans. And in fact, this also spilled over into Arabic literature. And this is why it's sort of is significant, because when we think about we think about the transatlantic slave trade, but there was a few other slave trades that existed. And this is something I want to also point out. Like, obviously we know the story of Bilal, right? So the enslaved Bilal. So there was the Indian Ocean slave trade. There was the trans-Saharan slave trade. And just because there were these slave trades does not mean that Africans by themselves were inherently enslavable, because we know from that Muslim empires, they enslaved people from Central Asia, from Europe. It was not limited to race. But it was during the modern period that we had, where eventually slavery was in the West was limited to either indigenous peoples or Black people. And then it focused mainly on enslaving Africans and coercing for their labor. So I want to kind of move beyond the history to think about, when we think about slavery and enslavement, that we have to not just assume, we have to challenge the tropes, the ideas that exist within many societies that justify the oppression of people. And going back to me, that little girl who eventually went on to the Gifted and Talented program, who was told that I was not, who knew from those books that I was inherently inferior, less intelligent. And then I just went on this discovery of my own people's struggle for liberation, and that despite many, many obstacles, had achieved a great many things. And for me, the idea of struggle, that's where the seeds were planted, that the struggle is what makes us noble as people. And for me, when I read the Sirah, when I read about the early prophetic the early community during the Prophet's time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you see people of modest means who set in motion our community and things that we benefit from. And I was just in a conversation today about that, of how we had a multiracial ummah of people of African descent from the land of Ethiopia, of Coptic people, Kurdish people, Persians, and they were all there and they helped form this community. And so, you know, this is where that intersects. So I want to kind of go back into that kind of history of Africa, and what did learning about Africa and its connection with Islam and how that eventually planted seeds for me of learning about the Moors in Spain. So I know we all have like learned about Andalusia and we, you know, about some of the empires that existed. And some of those did come from West Africa. So whether you had the Almoravids who from Mauritania, the Rabat, so that's like where their name came from. And as I learned about the Moors in Spain, I also learned about the Mali Empire. And so I learned about the Songhai Empire. And that was something that challenged that idea of Africa without a history, that I learned through learning about Black Muslims, that indeed Africans had a rich history and that we could also learn a great deal of history through Arabic sources. And in the 90s, when I started school, like when I was in high school, when I went on a field trip and I saw the movie Malcolm X, that planted a seed for me that a year later, eventually I became Muslim. Now, when we think about, mashallah, the contributions of African Muslims, this is something that's also very powerful. And I want to really kind of, when we think about who is the ideal Muslim, when we think about the tropes of who's likely to be Muslim, one of the things that we do teach in Muslim Arc is both the Asianness of global Islam and the Africanness of American Islam. And I'll go into that shortly. But when we look at statistics as far as global Islam, that sub-Saharan Africans make about 15% of the global Muslim population. And this becomes very significant because when we think about, in reality, that Arabs make about 18%. And then overlapped with that, that in many Arab countries, for example, I lived in Morocco, I lived in Egypt, and I lived in Kuwait. There are still significant Black communities, people who are of African descent. Some of them live there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So there's always been connection between Africa, the Mediterranean, all along the Sahara, and Africa and Arabia, and Africa and South Asia. So there's always been people in movement and connections. And in fact, if there are historical figures who have played great roles in each of those societies. For example, there's Malik Ambar, who ruled the Deccan Sultanate, and you had like the Sidi community. So there's an African diaspora in South Asia. Another form of resistance, or like we could see a major contribution to Arabic literature. You had Al-Jahid. And so when I was in Kuwait, there's a lot of pride in Al-Jahid. I saw street names named after him. But during the time of the Shu'abiyya, where you had during the 10th century of great movements and, you know, dynasties. And at this time, Persian was the height of culture, courtly culture in Muslim civilization. And that those who were Persian speakers said that Arabic did not have the chops to write prose. Like you couldn't do, like they would say that Arabic, You could do good poetry with Arabic, but you couldn't write essays. And Al-Jahiz, who was black, he challenged them and he wrote some of the most brilliant essays and demonstrated that Arabic could be used to write prose. So that's another little tidbit for Black History Month. But there was also struggles, right? So you had the Zanj Rebellion in Iraq or modern day Iraq at the time. So that was an uprising of enslaved Africans who were living in that region, and they rose up against their oppression. And it wasn't just the Zanj, it wasn't just the descendants of enslaved people who rose up, but other people joined them. And so I suggest we kind of look into that history, because I know there's many people that look to, in the West, and they look to African Muslims who rose up against oppression, like the Bahia revolts, that there were Muslims who played a role in Haiti's independence, and in forming free communities, both in the Caribbean, but also in the Americas with Sapelo Island. So please do look into Sapelo Square, because when we look at enslaved Africans in the West and how they maintained their autonomy, but they also did that when they were enslaved in the Mediterranean, in the Muslim world, in South Asia too. And that's what you could see within the Sidi, so like within the Sidi community in India. And you also had sailors. There's just so many great things. So as a historian, I'm just really struggling to think about, like, what are the major tidbits and takeaways. But if I was going to say that our major takeaway of looking at African history, of thinking about it, is that African Muslims have played a key part in spreading Islam, that they have been dynamic in embracing the faith and building new communities. And so recently, like in this, I was asked, like recently, or actually yesterday, so there was a question about the Spice Digest. And so that was a publication meant for educators, and I was asked to write a short essay on the history of Islam in Africa. So how did Africa develop how did Islam develop in Africa? And Islam has been in Africa since the inception of the religion. So we have to think about, where was the first hijrah? It was to Ethiopia. And so those early connections formed there. But Islam has also been in West Africa for 1,000 years, for over 1,000 years. And it first started not through conquest. So we have to remember that. It wasn't just Arabs and North Africans coming into Africa to conquer, but instead it expanded first through trade, where African rulers, who were very powerful at the time, they allowed some Muslim traders to trade in certain goods, and that Muslims had the power of the written script where they could record things. And so eventually there was a certain type of prestige with Muslims who could write, and that eventually became part of the courtly culture, where the ruling class became Muslim, and many of the regular people largely maintained their animist beliefs. And over time, like with the final stage and I talked about the 3 stages of, like, containment, mixing, and then expansion, like where Islam got established, was where eventually Muslim reformers started speaking out against oppressive practices and establishing Islamic law. And that's where you have the deep history of Uthman Danfodio and his daughter Nana Asma'u and Muhammad Bello. So, this history has been really profound for me when you think about it, when at the time, Uthman Danfodio, he was critiquing the House of Rulers who were taking part, who were allowing people, especially Muslims, to become enslaved along the trans-Saharan slave trade. And so he spoke out, eventually he spoke out against them and did launch a holy struggle against the oppression. And that holy struggle was multi-ethnic. It was Fulbe, it was Hausa. And Nana Asma'u played a huge role in educating the women who did not know that much about Islam. And it was not through conquest that Islam spread, but it was through the education of women that allowed for the reproduction of Islam in the region. And during that time, Islam had spread and deepened at a far greater rate than in all the hundreds of years before then. And that's just been such a powerful marker for me as we think about, as Muslim women, what is our role in reproducing the faith? And when we educate our children, we educate a nation. And even under colonialism, that Islam, when the Europeans did conquer parts of Africa, you would think that there would be a decline in Islam, but instead there were certain regions where Muslims were the minority, that there was large conversions through education, through people who were suffering under the colonial regime. They formed new communities and new identities. And so when we think about whole regions that were not Muslim, or where there was only maybe a few elite communities that were Muslim, that now we see the majority Muslims there. And I could share some of the books that I had read where they talk about those statistics, and they talk about the struggles of Muslim reformers under colonialism. The importance that we think about is not through the conquest, but the struggle of Muslims as they struggle to understand the faith, to embrace the faith, and they maintain a deep level of scholarship. When we think about African Muslims and their scholarship going back 1,000 years, that there are texts, there are libraries in Timbuktu that detail rich histories, that show that people in West Africa were able to maintain high levels of Islamic literacy, from fluency in Arabic, fluency in reading, memorization, where women became highly literate. And these were things that we don't really know. Like they don't teach these in high school. They don't teach them definitely in elementary schools. And you're not going to really get that in many colleges. But if you're studying African history and Islam in Africa, you could learn more about like reading texts through John Hunwick. That was like my first exposure. But he had started collecting archives of African literature in Ajami, and writings in Hausa, but they were using the Arabic script. But also you see local people who had mastery, and they traveled too. But what was interesting about studying Islam in northern Nigeria was that you had people that can get ijaza. They were able to do that and develop their scholarship without having to go to Azhar, even though that was something that they did do. So I found my research in Cairo that there was a Zawiya, that there were scholarships for students based on where they were from. So there was a scholarship, a WAC, that supported students who were coming from Bilad al-Takrur. So that's like what it was called. And that there was scholarships for students coming from Darfur region or Sudan. And so these were just those connections and those deep histories really inspired me through my studies. And then I was able to think back to that little girl who didn't think that we had a history. And when I was able to read more about the great epics of Askia Muhammad or Sundiata. So there's these great tales that you get out of Mali, about the scholars of Timbuktu, about the great wealth of some of the empires, and that challenged all of that sense of inferiority that I had. Now, as Muslims, where we're tasked with the idea that we were created of different tribes to get to know one another, it really behooves us to understand that as we study our own history to get a sense of who we are, that we also have to get to know our brothers and sisters who have different histories and different backgrounds, and make sure that we do not internalize narratives that were used to oppress them and enslave them. And that it's important for us to understand that even without the literature, that African people have rich histories, that they pass on their histories through poems, griots, visual arts, and other forms of communication, and that they, as a people, have so much to contribute to the world, and that Africanist scholars, people who study African history, have been creative in demonstrating both our change over time and how the skills and knowledge that have been passed on from generation to generation without written language. And for us as Muslims, where our own Prophet, sallallahu, he was not literate, but he passed on, the Quran was revealed to him, and he passed it on, and that we need to understand the importance of literature that's passed on from person to person. And as for those of us who are descendants of enslaved Africans, it's important for us to know that our history doesn't just begin with slavery, but we have a long, rich history that connects us, and that being Muslim also can help ground us and root us in our African heritage, and it can also root us and connect us with people globally, as Africa was never in isolation, that Africa has always been connected to the Mediterranean world, to South Asia, and even Asia itself. So there's many people that are uncovering root traces of Africans in as far as China and even Japan. So for me, when I was asked to give this talk, and thank you all for being patient with me as I try to bring together so many of my thoughts on African history and my own history, and the struggle to be able to both name oppression, to work against it, but to celebrate the struggle, to celebrate those who wrote against their oppression, like Frederick Douglass, those who wrote against their oppression, like Abdul Rahman, who was a prince in Africa, and he was enslaved, and he worked to free himself and his family. Of those who still did toil, and those who did fight to be free, and those who did survive that, and that how we can benefit, how we draw on their legacy of struggle. And we can take pride in that, as opposed to any type of shame. But we can also celebrate the many contributions and the greats. We could celebrate the kings, we could celebrate the queens. But I think as Muslims, what's really important for us to really own, to really hold tight to us, is that in our struggle, that there is joy. Our struggles, we can find that faithfulness, that's something that has been part of Black culture, of African culture. And for us, that's something that we should draw our greatest model from, not in being queens, but being people of faith. Jazakallah khair. So I'm opening up for questions, and I hope if there's anything that I touched upon that you have further questions, feel free to leave that in the chat box. or you can open your mic, however you want to facilitate this discussion. Alaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum. So we always like to leave time for the introverts, you know, to gather their thoughts together. But I do want to encourage people to ask questions. And we're just going to hang out here while you gather your thoughts together and put your questions together in the chat box. I think that's the best place for them. But maybe our admin would also like to put up a Q&A box just in case somebody would like to ask an anonymous question. Sometimes people do feel shy about their questions. They feel like, oh, I should know that.
There was a lot of
I don't really feel
terms
comfortable
that
asking that. So
yeah, I was like, oh, it's all over the place. So thank you all.
no, it wasn't at all. It was absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And here's a question from Samia. Do you have any book recommendations on African history? Sometimes, you know, part of the story
Well, what
is
I
not
could
the
do,
whole
I could
context.
follow up. I mean, I have tons of books, and it depends on what level that you want. So there are some really great books on the history of Muslims in Africa. There are some good compilations of African history. So I will definitely, right after this, I will send out the list and you could share. And so like I told you, I'm really bad with names, and so like I'm just like I'm blanking on the name, like the exact name. It's like it's beyond you know, it's yeah, there's like a particular name of a book. What I did find, like, and I'll just be very honest, when I was an undergraduate, I did European Islam because I did not like how they taught African history. It was just taught so sad. And it was really focused on like conquest, but it was really in graduate school, and I obviously did like the history of like I did both Middle East and African history, and it was just so beautiful. Like I knew I wanted to study it, and obviously Islam in Africa, but I think that there's just been such great volumes of work, but some of them just go so in depth into like one society or one region or one particular issue, and so I'm gonna find like a good compilation to you know, for African history, like so a couple good general books, and then those that are good for Islam in Africa.
And if you give us that list, what we'll do is we will post that on all
Mm-hmm.
of our sort of platforms, social media platforms, as well as in our WhatsApp threads. Um, so just a little announcement for those who are not using the app. You are probably struggling with the sound. We are expecting an update from Adobe February something or other coming up, so hopefully that problem will be fixed. But yes, there is a recording. So there will be a recording, and the sound should be just fine in the recording, inshallah. So if you did miss things and you feeling like, I need every detail, don't worry. You can always review it in the recording.
Yeah.
Okay. Uh,
Oh yeah, my personal story. So yeah, I have so many little writings and bios on me sharing that story about Black History Month, and that's where I mean, somebody asked me to write about Black History Month, and I remembered that, you know, like, and so I shared, you know, so I was asked to either there's Virtual Mosque and Muslim Matters where I talk about that. And then also there's a little bit about my Shahada story and how we fight white supremacy, which is like a really great compilation. And so they asked me to contribute kind of like any faith, like any reflection on faith and the struggle. And so that was also like where I shared the story of the 90s and like how Ziyada played a huge role, like the idea of like pilgrimage to places that had a sacred meaning to me, and like so I also shared that. So there's a little bit, it's sprinkled around like everywhere. Kayak. Mm-hmm.
I have a question. I want to show you a book that I ordered off of actually Instagram. Um, Do you know anything about this book, and do you think that it is a worthwhile book to go through and
Yeah,
do
I
the
just
exercises
ordered
with?
it, and if you go through it, because I want to find a team of people to go through it with me. So yeah, I would love to go through it with you. I'm currently going through, oh, I don't know if I could move, but it's called Healing, like, and it's by Annalise Singh. But Layla Saad is Muslim, so I had that as one of my lists of great books, and like underneath, which was my stack, were books that I wanted to show, like these were written by Muslim women about, like, that are great for Black History Month. But this one is, she's South Asian and
Mm-hmm.
Sikh, but it's like the healing from, like, mine shows it backwards, but racial healing handbook. And I just think anything that kind of has you reflect on how we've internalized this, and so I think that's where, for me, like, as opposed to, like, it was, the challenge for me is, like, this work is very personal, and I've been in this personal journey with the knowledge and, like, how I've engaged with the knowledge. And so it's been like this unfolding, right? Like, of studying of what have we been taught about ourselves and what have we been taught about other people. And so for me, I was taught
Yeah.
really horrible messaging around who I was as a person, and around Africans and my own African identity. And so for me, Islam was like a important gateway, even before any of this was popularized, before the media changed things. But to see, when you open up Malcolm X's book and he's in Ilorin, like, he's in Nigeria, and the connections of African students who eventually go on to independence movements, and then, but also how African Americans go to Africa, and then African Americans, like Malcolm X, he was connecting with leaders of, independent, like, nation states, who are fighting against neo-colonialism and colonialism. And that's been, to me, it was like Islam was such a powerful, uh, empowering force for, like, I don't have to, especially, then was like, I don't have to accept that my natural state is of servitude. And I don't have to be anybody else, like, you don't have to assimilate. You can make a contribution. You could be neighbors. You could do this work, but you're going to be like, I could be myself and have my culture and my own identity. And I also, and not just absorb that for me to fit in America, I have to deny this part of myself. And so that's what was really powerful about meeting Black Muslims, because that was like my first entryway. And then I started college, and I met Muslims of all backgrounds. I first learned to do wudu from Filipino Muslims, and I met Libyan Americans, and, like, in learning about, what was going on globally was just very empowering. And then also knowing that, from the Black radical tradition in this freedom struggle, they weren't just national. They weren't just fighting for the rights of African Americans. There were people that were working globally to fight for, like, to work towards the liberation of people in Palestine, like in Egypt, in Sudan. Like, there was so many connections. And that, to me, when you know that you're not alone in your struggle, it makes it, like, it's just really encouraging. Like, you have people of different backgrounds working together to ensure the dignity and autonomy of people. And, so that's, like, within the kind of freedom movement struggle. And then spiritually, like, for me, it was, um, also just to see the scholarship and exchange of learning that existed for, there's never not been a time in the United States where there hasn't been Muslims, and that Muslims have gone back and forth across the oceans. And that has also been, so I was talking with Ashanor, and she was saying, like, she had, like, some grandfather who was in India, like he was a trader, and that in the 20s, you know, like in the 50s, they were sailors and they were in America and the Carolinas and the Caribbean, you know, like all of those things. And it's like, for me, like learning Black History Month has not been about an isolationist thing, but knowing that we've always been connected and exchanged intellectually, and that when you had like the were they the Sultan? Yeah, the Sultan of Morocco writing letters to get somebody free. Like he's like, no, he's my subject, free him. Like that's something that's really powerful, you know, and just knowing that the enslaved Muslims were they were like writing, you know, and even sometimes they're like when they wrote the like they were say like write the Bible, and a person would write and they just write the Fatiha, you know, like so it's just like like you know like the ways that they subverted it, and you know that looking at like Sapelo Island, even though like I think the last Muslim was probably like 1910s or something, that that it's feasible that people living in the 20th century had met um, enslaved. There's my daughter, she's in the background. That they met Muslims, you know, and that still in Sapelo Island they pray East. The women cover their hair in the church. Like you could still see the vestiges of Islam, and that for us, like we call that Sankofa, like of the idea of drawing from the past for strength and looking, you know, bringing that into the future. And so, um, you know, now when I was looking at like Wakanda, like I saw, oh, so, yeah, I do the essay. It's SAP as in Paul, ELO. And a great website is Sapelo Square. So they have great resources on African American Islam. Um, And so there was like the Gullah Islands. And so they really worked to have some autonomy outside of, you know, like, okay, we're here in this state, but they maintained their religious practices in their communities. And like there was they call it like the Bilali community where he still made like he had like a fiqh book, you know, like so it's just like wow, like we still have text, you know, from enslaved African Muslims, and that was just something that still like when I think about like my ancestors or predecessors or people that I draw a model from, that gives me strength for the work that I do. Because sometimes like my work is very hard, like this, as this, you know, I'm sure you all know, starting an organization from the ground up, but also when we have internal and external threats, you know, from hostile administration or just the racism that exists, you know, like it's very difficult. But what I do draw so much strength from is like I said, going back to that early Muslim community where they were almost wiped out, but what kept them together was like that deep knowledge that they had of each other and trust and solidarity that they had. Um, and then the second is then looking at all the points in history where communities of Muslims, and I also draw inspiration from non-Muslims, and what really resonates with me are communities of Muslims and Muslim women who really worked to maintain dignity and pass on something to future generations. And that to me keeps me like, that inspires me, where I'm just like, you know, I'm not going to just give up and just, you know, get a job or take off the scarf and just do something else to fit in, but just to say, hey, like if we benefit from what they did, you know, like so there were people who fought against slavery and they never saw freedom, but and that there was almost, and we just passed 150 years ago, for my ancestors, it was illegal to teach them how to read. And that those who struggled and risked their lives to learn how to read and to free themselves, I benefit directly from that struggle. And it behooves me to do something right now to plant that whatever trees that I can, that somebody 150 years from now can benefit, that they could see what we did as Muslim women and say, Muslims did that. Despite all the oppression, all these people that didn't want Muslim women to learn about their faith, all the Muslims that didn't want Muslim women to learn across difference. And that people will look, somewhere there's going to be some documentation, and they're going to be like, this is what the Muslim women did globally. And they're going to take some inspiration. They're going to benefit from what we did. And I pray that Allah accepts our good deeds.
I mean,
yeah.
We're at the top of the hour, but I think there's a really important question in the Q&A box, and I think probably you could talk to that for a long time, but if you could just give just like two, because if you could just say two things or three at tops about, I'm going to read the question because not everybody else can see it. It says, I live in a city which is very historically and racially segregated. I'm finding it really hard to find diverse spaces where I live. I want my children to grow up with diverse friends, and especially Black Muslims, because we really value their voice and it's part of our Muslim American identity. How can I reach out and create intentionally diverse spaces? Or I wonder, is that the right question? Or is the question, how do I feel comfortable to enter into spaces that are not my community already? Like, how can I overcome the shyness of going into new places and just being like, hi guys, how can I volunteer?
I feel like both. I think, segregation, like there's structural racism that exists, and Muslims were impacted by that. So there's big cities that are segregated. We have to work across geographic different, and people do it, right? Like we have to become better ambassadors for each other, and sometimes travel and just get out and build authentic relationships. And that may be, you have to start small. You have to kind of build trust, to get outside our comfort zone. And we have to really learn and appreciate, sometimes it's not going to be easy. There's sometimes distrust historically, but I think that there are some models for creating those programs. And, like whether we create a weekend retreat and a class meeting in a middle zone, meeting outside in the country, like inviting some of the youth, like really being, I think, having very clear objectives too for why you want your children to come together. So that could be, forming, like, being very like, you want your friends, your children to not, to be able to live in a pluralistic society. In the first place, like, of us connecting heart to heart is important. So I think having intentional children's programs that do kind of that ambassador thing of inviting, people out to, like, and making it accessible too, so going to some communities, listening, and, like, so I think that'll be, and we're thinking about that consciously ourselves too. Like, so how do we as Muslim Arc, like we're very committed to diversity and inclusion. And so, yeah, it's going to be a lot of commuting in our segregated world.
Maybe you already have this, but I personally would appreciate any kind of sort of cheat sheet that helps people create authentic new relationships fast. So someone, when you're in college and when you're really young, you're a young mom, it's much easier to create those relationships because you can connect on your babies, you can connect on the classes you're taking. But when you're going into a new place and you're in your 40s or 50s and the other women in their 40s and 50s are just as legitimately busy as you, and they don't have, you're the one coming in and saying, hi, like, I want to try to have a relationship with you. It feels sometimes like people don't quite know what to do. And so I wonder if there could be, maybe there already exists somewhere online, cheat sheet for making friends, authentic relationships. And at an old, because that has nothing to do really with race.
Yeah.
It has to do with being older and trying to find ways to connect with people when we're not quite used to connecting with brand new people on an authentic level. I think
Yeah.
that's a really important thing that you said, because we're used to just being polite, but our authentic relationships are the people that we've known for a long time. And if we're really going to connect across
Yeah.
suburban boundaries, we're going to
I would
have
say
to
one
stretch
cheat
for that.
sheet is
All right.
storytelling,
Well,
like
I really,
doing
go ahead.
storytelling circles in the halaqa, but then we have to learn to intensively listen to each other and then hold space for our stories. But like when you allow everyone to really share their story, that, so that really helps build stronger bonds. And then, being committed to following up, keeping the stories, like allowing people to share without trying to get comfortable with what they're saying. And but yeah, we have some tips for Ramadan anti-racism, and I've always wanted to make it like outside of Ramadan to like some tips for how to connect out across difference.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, just shoot them our way, and we'll put those as well we'll put the links on our platforms. All right, I want to thank everyone. I noticed it.
Hmm.
We're over the hour, so I know some people had appointments and things to go to, but I really appreciate all the time you gave us this morning, and it was really wonderful. And I know that everyone here, again, I wish we were all together so you could
No.
hear the rounding, the round,
Thank you.
the loud applause, and this standing ovation that you are getting from all of us. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you and bless
Amen.
you بالدنيا وآخرة, make you have the su'ada darain, so that you really see the blessings of this work in both
Amen.
worlds, inshallah. And consider all of our resources at Rabata a place where you can, help to further this work of the
Thank you.
anti-racism collaborative. I got to learn that. My prediction is
It's
I shall say
fine.
that
It's
wrong a
like
few
we
more
just got
times
to
because that's
see
kind of how my brain
collaborative
works.
connection, coalition. Yeah, thank you.
Collaborative is beautiful. All right, so I am being told to make some announcements. What announcements do you want me to make? Oh, there we are. Okay, so a reminder that the Rabat Spring term is still open. If you have not registered for your classes yet, get your butt in gear, excuse me. And our speed reading course, if you are struggling with getting all the books read that you want to read on your shelf, definitely sign up for the speed reading class. People have taken it before. It's a limited number, so we only allow 10 students in that class. If you get on a waiting list, we will try to open up another one. Also, our Daybreak Press Book Awards, if you know authors, let them know that our Daybreak Press Book Awards are now open for submission. So they will submit their book for whatever you judging, actually. It's a contest. And in the end, the winners will get a medal as well as the thing that goes on the book itself. So they can actually publish their book with the award on it, which is really good for getting books in libraries and things like that. Tajweed Workshop, if you are a Tajweed instructor and you are already at that level, you can sign up for the Tajweed Workshop in New Haven, Connecticut at the end of March. Is that it? Woohoo. And our save the dates, just want to remind you that the Ribat retreat and the youth camp in the United States will be in July, and the UK youth camp will be the end of August, so save those dates sort of in your head. And July 16th will be our very first graduation for our teachers, Ribat Teachers Certificate. I'm really excited about that. And so if you can be there on July 16th in Dallas and attend our graduation, we'd be so happy to have you. And that includes you, Margari. If you could come, we would love to have you at that graduation. And the retreat, you can see the dates there, so you can save those dates to sign up for the Ribat retreat. And the youth camp registration is not open yet, but that's coming soon. All right, Rajab, just another reminder, Rajab is coming up. It's February 24th, guys. So start getting ready. If you have fasting to make it up now. While the days are still shorter. In March, they will get longer. Make your fasting up from last year. And inshallah, we will all have a beautiful month of Ramadan together, and Rajab, and Sha'ban, and summer, and every day going forward. Thank you again. May Allah bless you and send blessings on you and your daughter and your work and all of the things that you do every day. And do note that we have opened up platforms in social media for Ribat. Before this, we only had Rabata and Daybreak. Now we have a Ribat platform that is there so that students can be reminded of, can get information, but also so that you can, like, have fun, like build that sort of online community. So follow us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram. That's where they are, Instagram and Facebook. It's called Rabata Ribat, okay? Rabata Ribat. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And there's a little giveaway over there where people are giving away 15 minutes of my time. Very interesting. So I don't know, how are we giving it to you, the 15 minutes? No, I think we're going to hang out together. So, all right. Have a wonderful day. For real now. This is it. Assalamu alaikum, everybody.